Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the ZhenWei podcast. I am your host, Zhen Way. This podcast is all about the stories and fascinating insights as I explore the areas in life, career, and tech. For those of you who jumped right in, I spent the last decade in health tech, consulting, and banking, but started off with a major in psychology. I love being in the intersection of social science and technology, so I look forward in sharing some insights and interviews with you in these areas. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. In today's episode, we're going to be talking to my friend Zhen Way. He started off like me in with a major in psychology, but decided to venture into a full-time role in software engineering. So he was originally from Malaysia, but since then he's been spending more than 7 years in Germany. So I wanted to really ask him how his journey began, and for some advice for someone who is similar to him, and how's life in Germany altogether. So let's jump right into today's episode. Okay, Zhen Way, thank you so much for saying yes to this, right? We were just catching up briefly just now, and it's been more than 10 years, right? Do you even remember when was the last time we actually kind of like catch up?
I think it was in uni, so sometime in uni, but also in uni, I think kind of our paths didn't really cross that much. We had a couple of events that we shared, but then
Yeah. I remember. Do you remember the brand challenge that we participated, the L'Oreal brand challenge
Yeah. Yeah.
together with CN? I think that was probably the last time that we crossed path. I think
Yeah.
that
I
was
think
that was
so.
pretty wild. And I also remember that we were running against each other in the student council
Yeah.
election as well, and that was pretty fun. I remember that, man, we lost by single digit, man. Now that it's
Yeah.
state election time in Malaysia, it's pretty fun. Like, we lost by single digit, man.
I think that's like the best kind of uh, election, right? Like both parties are popular and also
Yeah.
well supported, and yeah.
Yeah. Hey, I said that when I reached out to you, I said that I've been quietly observing your career path, and what I meant by that is that, I mean, as you know, I kind of went into a mental health tech startup as
Yeah.
well, right? So because of that, I think like I started to kind of pay attention to people who are kind of in the space in technology and things like that. And then I saw that you not only you became a software engineer, you became a software engineer in Germany, no less. So I kind of like gonna say like, oh yeah, that's pretty interesting. And fast forward a couple of years down the road, and here I am trying to kind of find out a little bit more about how you made that decision. So obviously, to kind of respect your time, I wanted to really just go through your journey, and I found that you've been a software engineer for more than 7 years. You've done everything, right? It seems like you've done like architecture design, which is designing the whole back-end stuff for those of us that are a little bit more less aware about those things. Like architecture is basically the design of the entire system, and then you've done like migration, integration, and then you're teaching Python, which is a programming language for a non-profit
Yeah.
school. You've done like I think mostly technology that is tech companies that are probably in the education space and now in HR space, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think it's a mix. So when I first arrived here, maybe just as a backstory,
Yeah.
I was just looking for a job. I wasn't really thinking of branching into tech, like
Right.
intentionally.
Right.
And I chanced upon a kind of a web development agency and also a e-commerce marketing agency.
Right.
That's where I started a part-time working student position.
Right.
But
And
then after, yeah, go ahead.
no, and that's really fascinating to me, because what I also found, this is all based on publicly available information,
Yeah,
right?
sure, go.
I
Yeah.
saw that you were already doing freelancing marketing stuff, like like HTML, CSS, like website coding and stuff like that in 2008. And I believe that was before we started studying psychology. And then you end up in your position. So I'm quite curious in terms of like, maybe as the first question, right? You
Yeah.
already were quite technical in that sense. You were learning up all this stuff, and I think it was back in the Blogspot days and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yes.
WordPress days. Why do you decide to study psychology, and perhaps like how do you get into this whole tech space and got very curious? Because I myself, I
Hmm.
think started just with computer games, right? And then I thought like I could be somewhere in the tech industry, but I found out that I'm not suitable. So what about you? Like how did you get into being so techy, and then but then went into studying psychology?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think let me just answer the tech part first. So I was pretty lucky in a sense as a kid to have parents who were both in technical areas. They worked in technical jobs. Like my dad was an electrical electronics engineer. My mom was a draftsman drafter, and they both needed use of the computer. So we had a computer in the 90s, and they were pretty willing to let me use it. I think that's a, I guess as a, I don't know, 5 year old is not, and like your very expensive PCs back then, it's not like a common thing, I guess, to let your kid mess around with it. But that kind of gave me a sense of like, oh yeah, what's the worst that could go wrong, right? Like I think I got pretty used to just messing around with like back then it was still DOS, so like command line interfaces. You have Windows, but it was kind of a separate thing. So I started from there, and it was a series of, I would say, fortunate events in a sense that in my primary school we also were taught HTML and Quick Basic, which was also very rare. I think it was an experimental
Mm.
kind of program because it
Yeah.
was definitely not common in Malaysia.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that kind of kickstart like, oh yeah, and I know like what the web is made of in a sense, and
Right.
also what stuff ran in the background. And in high school and then college, I think those were the years where you just mentioned like Blogspot, WordPress became really popular, or even earlier like GeoCities, like hosting your own website and making stuff was
Mm.
a thing back then. No social media, so everyone had their own little thing and it was very easy to set it up.
Right.
I think that was when I kind of cultivated this, I don't know, interest in helping people set up their websites or even tweak my own. And
Mm.
yeah,
Right.
so very lucky to just spend a lot of time because it was the right moment naturally.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's where my interest in tech grew, and also some of the skills, I guess. Yeah.
Right.
And so for me, it always seemed more like a side thing than a main thing. It was always like a hobby, not, and even when I freelance and part time was like, yeah, sure, this is cool income, but never really thought of it as what I want to do in a career. And apart from like more technical stuff, I also was curious to know, generally how things work. And so the human mind is not something you typically would have an opportunity to kind of,
Yeah.
I don't know, dabble in. It was not that easy at least. So I thought, okay, psychology seems pretty interesting. And
Right.
that's how
Right.
I chose to, do psychology in the first
Right.
place.
Maybe to kind of really just kind of picked on some of those things that you've mentioned, right? Like you
Yeah.
mentioned that you studied like programming in primary school. It's definitely very uncommon in Malaysia because when I was in primary school, the only thing that I remember was playing a Pokemon emulator out of the floppy disk. That's
Hmm.
that's the only thing I remember. I don't remember any kind of programming,
Yeah.
kind of thing. I only got exposed to programming, I think in secondary school, and even then it was a kind of like a side course that I've taken. Like what are some of the things that fascinated you about tech when you were young? Was it like being able to kind of punch a bunch of codes or lines in and produce
Hmm.
something? Was that, or was it like being able to, was there any kind of like validation from your parents to kind of keep that
Hmm.
interest going, right? Because it's very easy to I can imagine being an 11 or a 12 years old a kid, right? Programming was quite rigorous as an exercise, and you can actually
Hmm.
lose interest pretty fast, right? So
Yeah.
was there any kind of like validation or encouragement from your parents growing up, or it was really just your own fascination that you were able to
Hmm.
kind of just get things work, right?
I think it's a mix of both. So, in terms of like kind of parental validation, I think it was quite mixed from both my parents. Both my parents worked in technical jobs, and they definitely realized like computers would be a thing
Mm.
you would need to learn how to use in the future. They definitely helped me explore stuff, but not necessarily in programming or like a technical background. I think, in fact, my dad was he was not against it, but he was pretty cautious about it because I think in the late 90s there was like a tech boom and bubble. And
Yep.
then
Yep.
after that he was like, probably not gonna work out. So
Yeah, 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 yeah. The
um,
Y2K was our time as well, right?
yeah. So it was kind of mixed. I think personally, I found a lot of interest in finding out how and why things work.
Yeah.
And for me, looking initially, I think one of the things that why I dove into it was I had some games and I really wanted to know how did they, I don't know, came up with some numbers. I think I remember it was some kind of American football game. I was like, how do you, it was like a text-based simulation of an American football game, I would say.
The
And
kind of
then,
games you play, man. Like I was just playing Pokemon. I mean, you just heard I said I played Pokemon, and you were playing a word-based simulation of an American football game. Nevertheless, what do you remember? What the name of the game was?
no, I don't remember. I only know it was somehow related to Quick Basic, and I could
Right.
open it up and see how it ran in the
Wow.
background, and like, see. So I was like, that was kind of the thing that I was very curious about.
Right. Was it kind of like a Swift playground equivalent nowadays, where you kind of like learn and play at the same time?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, Quick Basic was, I think it was interpreted. So it's a bit like Python, a bit like Swift, where you could just mess around with stuff and then immediately get feedback. I think that is pretty cool.
Right.
Yeah.
And kind of like fast forward a little bit around like you've mentioned around like the human mind is not something that you very often get to kind of dabble in, and I guess because you were curious, you wanted to go into it, and also that your parents were in fairly kind of like quote unquote technical background. When you first brought up that you wanted to go into psychology, what were their kind of like first reaction? And being an Asian family, is like, are they
hmm
concerned about the career, I guess viability of being in psychology and so on, right?
Yeah. I think initially their impression of psychology was more the typical psychiatric background, like you're gonna work in a hospital or a
So they were
clinical
okay. You're gonna
psychologist.
be a doctor. They're fine.
In a way,
Right.
but then initially that was definitely the idea they had
Right.
about me studying psychology, and for me it was also more or less in that direction. Like I was also inspired by I think one of the school counselors we had. I was briefly studying in Singapore, and there we had a school counselor which taught us a bit about counseling, and I was like, oh, this is a very cool method to like coach people, or it was not so much therapy rather than counseling, coaching, mentoring, kind of nudging people in the right direction.
Right.
And I was very interested in that as well. So was definitely more in that direction. But then I don't know. As I study it, I realized, maybe I'm more interested in the other parts of how psychology applies to the rest of our day-to-day stuff or even work.
Yeah, I think that's pretty similar to me as well, because I started off thinking about, I'm quite curious about why people make decisions, and sometimes
hmm
certain decisions were made that is kind of like in an irrational manner, and I wonder why, right? And then I thought like perhaps more on a coaching, counseling, therapy kind of path, and then I realized that maybe not. Then I encountered like organizational psychology, and that becomes a little bit more practical and things like that,
hmm
right? So I think I can really resonate with that as well. And after you've kind of completed your undergrad, right? I realized that you went into I think your first job was with a bank, right? So one of
Yeah,
the largest bank in Malaysia, Maybank. And then
yeah.
you went back to tutoring in our university, Help University. What's happening over there? What's kind of like your thought process around, like, started off in banking, being the graduate trainee, right? The apprentice, right? I think it's a very highly sought after program, right?
hmm
What happened there? What was the thought process when you graduated, right?
hmm I think I distinctly remember it was kind of a career day, career fair, and I put in my CV. I think we were all just walking around, and so I got into interview process. I didn't really think very much of it initially, but then at a later part, I thought this would be a pretty interesting because of how it was structured. It had multiple kind of attachments to different departments. You could cycle through. some of them, and it was interesting to see how, different departments work, how they work together, especially in a large organization. I mean, I think I realize the value of it now more than back then. Initially, I was just curious, like, okay, sounds very impressive and prestigious. Why not, just go into it as a first job? Now I realize the value of that. Unfortunately, I actually didn't complete it. It was only 6 months before I chose to left. It was not even past the confirmation period.
Mm.
Because back then I thought it was a bit too boring. I definitely was very impatient, being,
Right.
young, 20 odd
Yeah.
years old. I was like,
Yeah.
wow, working in a bank is really slow and really boring.
Right.
Even if I could jump around in different departments, it was still very slow and boring.
Uh-huh.
Kind of in hindsight, I think what was very interesting was understanding how people work together in a large organization kind of teaches you about how people came up with these processes in the first place and
Yeah.
these structure. Like it's not very easy to come up with these things from scratch. I mean, I'm saying in hindsight now,
Yeah.
but back then, initially, it was more like a sense of prestige, a sense of like, oh,
Mm.
this is going to be interesting because I get to see a lot of things. I was also definitely more interested in the area of organizational psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And my first impression of the human capital department back then was that I think some of the senior managers were geared very much into that more like, how do we create an organization of excellence, not so much the usual HR administration kind
Mm.
of direction that
Mm.
most
Right.
organizations would have. So I was pretty convinced back then. So that's one of the reasons why I chose my first job. Yeah.
Right, 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 right. Yeah, I think, as I was looking at your profile, I realized that, I kind of followed a similar path where I went into a management trainee program in a
Yeah.
bank, no less.
You
And then
were,
I ended up in
you
the
were
human capital
yeah.
human capital team as well. So I fully recognize what you're saying in terms of like, sometimes, certain areas can seem a bit slow, but it was really interesting to be able to kind of learn how large organization function. Especially, I remember there was a story that someone told me around. I don't know whether this one was they're trying to kind of hype us up to really learn and pay attention to the rotations. But someone said that, there's one of the founder, a banker, right, a very famous banker. What this person did was that they when they went into different departments, right, they will write down a lot of notes in terms of how exactly to set it up, and eventually went on to open up their own bank. So, you need to have the same kind of like spirit to be able to that kind of curiosity to really jot it down if you want to be successful and really to learn the inside out, right? So I thought like, okay, I guess this is how you apply psychology in a sense, like, really trying to kind of paint that big picture for people to strive towards, right?
Mhm.
But you went to help for tutoring, like what what's the mindset behind that? Was it largely driven by, you were considering to kind of further your interest in organizational psychology?
Mhm. I think for me, yeah. So my interest also in psychology was in education.
Mm.
I always thought that was a very crucial aspect of building kind of a society in general at large. And I personally like the kind of the routine and the process of teaching and learning. And so one of the reasons of going back was like, okay, I do want to maybe think about venturing into teaching and academia. So I did that for 2.5 years. That
Right.
was it was also very easy to go back. I think I was familiar with how everything worked.
Mm.
It was a good time to just say, okay, uh,
Right.
let me rethink what I really want to do. For sure, the first couple of jobs I had were all thinking about like what I want to do next. I didn't really have a very strong sense of direction. I knew
Right.
generally my interests, yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it's this.
I remember. I think one of the first few subjects, right? I think it was one of our lecturer. I think Mr. Franklin. He was talking about how, or was it Dr. Go? I cannot remember. He said that you are
Huh.
in the minority if you know exactly what you want, because majority of people at our age at that point of time, right, definitely do not know what they want. So I
Mhm.
think I think I think it just goes to show that, what, sometimes it can take a few years in terms of trying to figure it out, right? Heck, I mean, like I thought I knew what I wanted, uh, like fast forward until today, after spending like 3 years in a health tech company, I am taking a career break, wondering what I should do next.
Mhm.
So I think,
Maybe
yeah, go ahead, yeah,
maybe it's a good time to also just
yeah,
ask you about your
yeah,
kind of your journey, because I
right,
also only see whatever is public available to me on
yeah, yeah,
LinkedIn.
yeah,
And you were initially in a bank, and then you went into kind of management consulting, I
yeah,
would say,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then into like starting your own mental health tech company. Like
yeah.
what spurred like these moves and transitions?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking me back as well. I think I think similar to you, I think I really think that we have more common than we realize, that I've mentioned, right? So I think it's going into banking. I think was really I see it as a kind of like a jump stepping stone, right? Trying to kind of be able to get a decent first salary, because I thought that that would be an advantage after I decide whatever I want, right? So I wasn't quite sure I wanted to go into banking, but it's kind of like the first few jobs that came, that landed on the desk, so to speak, right? Um, I learned a lot during those times. I was actually not in human capital in the first place. I was in one of the departments that does housing loans, right? Mortgage. Really not my cup of tea. And then I decided that, you know what? Let's go into human capital, learn a bunch of, and did a bunch of learning and development stuff over there. I think there was a little bit of so for my next move into management consulting, I think there's a little bit of a push and pull factor. I'm gonna be honest, right? I think I it was definitely my tenure was definitely shorter than I expected, because of some factors, but I was referred to into management consulting by a friend that I met during the interview process, right? So I think the key thing here is always make friends. So like even during the interview process, I made some friends, and she was in consulting, and she kind of like pulled me in, and because of the decisions that. In hindsight, right? I wasn't a genius to say like, okay, I'm gonna do this, then eventually I'll end up there, right? I think you can relate to that as well.
Yeah.
But because of the few things that I wanted to do, I was kind of like impatient as well to kind of just try different things. I was then positioned for a kind of like a HR project, for an IT based company. Then I'm like,
Hmm.
great, I can slowly get into the tech space, but doing something that I kind of already have some relationship with, right? And I spent many years in consulting, doing various kind of projects, right? They throw you all kinds of projects, right?
Hmm.
So everything from very tech based to like management consulting based, like for example like change management, which is basically dealing with humans, adapting them to different change, organizational related kind of change, right? Fully expecting that I'm going to apply some knowledge that we've learned in undergrad, but we all know that it's a bit hard, it's a bit far-fetched. You really got to dig deep and be really familiar with some of these concepts to apply them. But because of that, I think, I think my own personal interest in dabbling with tech to really just, I think I'm very appreciative of the fact that I was curious enough to understand basic stuff like how does database work, what are processes, what are RAMs, what are the different back end, front end stuff, right? So I'm curious enough to understand those concepts and be able to learn on the job for the past 6 years, in consulting. And that kind of led me to the mental health tech company that I joined, eventually. So I didn't start it. I was actually referred to, by one of my best friends in psychology, Douglas. You should know him, right? So Douglas
Yep.
referred me to the founder, right? And then we kind of built it together, with about five person. And
Oh, I
then
see.
as by the time I left, we have about 20 over of us, and we've managed to kind of raise a couple of million US dollars as part of the capital injection to grow the company, right? But not gonna lie, as much as it's very exciting and fulfilling, being in an early stage startups does have a price to pay in a sense that it's quite consuming, and I realized that I gotta prioritize. I've got a 9-month-old kid now.
I
That's something you don't see on LinkedIn, I suppose. So I've got a
Yeah.
9 months old kid now, right? So nine months son. So my son is 9 months old, and I need to think about what are some of the things I need to do lah. And I think the ultimately I'm proud of what we have achieved. But
Hmm.
yeah, but I think it's about time for me to kind of recenter myself and kind of figure out what I do next. So yeah, I think that's a little bit about I guess my journey as well, right? Hopefully that's also interesting to you as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah,
Yeah, congrats, I mean, belatedly,
thank
for
you. Yeah.
being a
I
dad.
mean, they say your life changed after you have a child. It's true. There's no cliche in that. It's definitely true, man. But I mean, back to you, right? In terms of like, you did that for a couple of years, and then for tutoring for a couple of years, and I saw that you wanted to kind of, I guess related to your interests around education and the importance of education. You wanted to do learning sciences. Did you pick Germany as a country consciously, or was it something of a time and opportunity kind of situation?
I think it was opportunity. It was both. So Germany, there were kind of two to three reasons why I picked Germany. Specifically the LMU, like Ludwig's Maximilians University of Munich. One was that two of our seniors were already enrolled in the program before me,
Mm.
Kamini and Elvin. I
Mm-hmm.
think you probably know both of them, right? And they both were very positive about the program, about the general pedagogical stuff, research stuff. And the other part was that Germany was much more affordable than other countries, so you pay a very minimal fee every year. I think I think every semester, every 6 months, it's like 200 euros for like a transport ticket and administration fee, and that is way
Wow.
cheaper than the UK or Denmark or all the other European
Right.
countries, definitely
Right.
North America.
Wow. Yeah.
They also allow you to work part time, up to 20 hours a week
That's
on your
amazing.
study
Wow.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So all these kind of lined up. I thought, okay, cool, this is very cool. My sis also went abroad to Germany, on like the AFS, like American Field Service program, for a
Mm.
year, and she was also very positive about the culture here. So many things pointed me. I was also considering Denmark and the UK, but price and other factors
Mm.
eventually led me to choose Germany. Yeah.
Right. And and is that how like you kind of like landed your first, I guess, like formal tech job? Because I realized that you were freelancing on on some of the tech related project as a software engineer and all that,
Hmm.
right? So like how do you actually kind of like landed your first kind of like formal job as a software engineer, right? Because I can imagine it being not easy because you have all sorts of background, right? You have banking background, which is probably on the business side. You have education background. You have psychology background. You've done a bunch of freelancing on the side, but to be able to kind of convince people to kind of give you that first job, was it really
Yeah.
the portfolio, or was it
Hmm.
like, hey, somebody invested in your potential, right? So share with us a little bit about that, right?
Yeah. I think my first job was initially just for a part-time web development and maintenance. I think it was for a couple of websites that was at least on the job description. And I think that is kind of the entry level position because maintaining websites, dealing with WordPress, Blogspot, Joomla, various CMSs, is typically not the most technical. You could kind of work around as long as you have a technical background, but not necessarily a ton of programming experience. And that was kind of definitely the level that I went into. I did not go into it as already established software engineer, web developer. It was more entry level, but I was looking for a way to fund my expenses here. And
Mm,
even so, we were capped at 20 hours a week, right? Like pragmatically speaking, that caps like how much you can earn. And a regular, like, if you work in a restaurant or whatever, I think the minimum wage back then was 12 euros. You probably get 12 to 13 euros per hour, which was not bad. But I think in the tech space, even at an entry level position, I think they were paying 15 or 16 euros per hour for such a position. I was like, okay, I mean, I have the skills.
yep.
It's also relatively easy. I don't have to walk around all day or do
Yeah.
manual labor. Sure,
Man,
why not, right?
yeah, service industry, man. Like I was
Yeah.
I was a waiter when I was 16. I would definitely encourage everybody to do it once, but I will never want to do it
Yes.
again. It's so
Same.
challenging.
I also did it when I was 16 for like half a year to a year in like a
Yeah.
restaurant.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, after that I was like, nope.
Not gonna do it, man. Not when you're like what, 25, 26.
Yeah.
But I mean, talk to me a little bit about that first interview, right? How do you find that opportunity? Like, did they want you to kind of be able to kind of speak
hmm
German, or is it because it's programming language? Hey, it doesn't matter what we speak, right? Yeah, yeah. Talk to me a little bit that
Um,
first interview, right?
Yeah, sure. So I think I applied to this from like there was an agency who does working student positions, like academic work,
Mm,
and they had a couple of positions open. This was one of them, and they were pretty positive about it. I think because they liked the founder Max, and he was running sort of an e-commerce agency as well. So like he did consulting for Amazon. I think Amazon back then was only starting to grow in Germany, was not already a super big thing. Um, Amazon, Google, a couple of like platforms to sell marketplaces, and they were also running on the side, like on his own, like web development agency. That's where you get the most of your kind of transactional capital from, because otherwise your web. I think the idea was like the e-commerce platform would more be the typical SaaS startup where you can scale a lot, but initially you would need capital, and the easiest way to earn kind of that kind of money was a very typical service, which is like web development. Just
right.
people
Yep.
always need websites, people
Absolutely.
always
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
optimize their marketing,
Yeah.
do that, charge them, get
Evergreen. Yep.
money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
So that was kind of that part of the business. Initially, when I went to it, I obviously didn't know all of this. I think my first impression was like, oh, this is a very young startup. I think everyone there was like younger than 30. The founder was relatively, he was like always he's always like this gruff, large German, not even a typical stereotypical German. It's more like he comes from
Yeah.
Bavaria, where Munich
Yeah.
is, and here
Yeah.
people are not the typical German you think of, like relatively slim, blonde, blue eyes kind of thing. These people are like you can think of like a blend between like the Germans and Italians, like but they're relatively large. So like they're all quite tall, all
Yeah.
quite
Yeah.
either I would say like round or well built. So they're
Mm-hmm.
all large.
Yeah.
And they speak in like very deep undertones and like very gruff. And also the local dialect is always seen as like very uh,
Direct and blunt.
direct and kind of like rough sounding compared to like
Right. Right.
typical high German, standard German.
Right.
And so like it was pretty terrifying because I was like, oh, I don't know anything. I don't speak German. So I did not study German. I only studied a little bit of German because this master's program was also in English.
Right.
And I had the impression from Novin and Kamini, who lived here, that you can get by without too much German. So I also didn't know that much German. I was like, oh shit, this is gonna be a disaster, right? Like I walked
Right.
into the office. I think it was a bit south of Munich. We
Yeah.
traveled like an hour by train there, and he I think he could tell, like, from my CV. I think the main thing that stood out to him was that I did a bunch of freelance projects. I didn't
Mm.
really have, a typical, software development experience saying, like, okay, you
Mm.
progressed from an intern to a junior programmer
Mm.
to a mid-level programmer to a senior programmer. It's more like, okay, you've done some projects. And I think he appreciated this part of it because he was also in a similar position where he needed to sell web development services and not so much kind of a typical, like, oh, let's just develop or engineer some stuff. It was definitely more of I think you could help us in a way to deliver these services as a whole, and you have that perspective of a freelancer, that you typically have to talk to the customers, you have to understand what they want, you have to also program it, and you also have to deliver it. So
Right.
that was one thing I think that kind of prompted him to say, okay, this is an interesting profile.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think what you brought up was pretty interesting, right? Because, further down the road, we definitely needed to hire like software engineers in startups. And of course, I've worked with a few, in consulting as well. And they always I mean, the stereotype is really that the technical software engineers, they don't quite work well with the business. That's always the stereotype, right? And you always needed somebody to translate the technicalities to the business and all that kind of stuff, right? So what you brought up was really interesting because because of that perspective, you're able to explain it in such a way that people can understand. Because, for example, I realized that later down the road, like something as simple as showing your status whether you're online or not, just to make that accurate and stuff like that, it's much more complex than just showing a green button, right? And to be able to explain it to somebody that's not technical, it is a skill. It is a communication skill, and I think I think he's pretty sharp to be able to know that that's the advantage of having someone like you to be able to really just translate whatever requirement the clients have into something that actually works on the back end as well. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah. I'll have that in mind when I needed to kind of build a team next time as well.
Yeah.
And he was not so much concerned about your language ability and just you know what, your skills is good enough. Let's go, right? Was
Yeah,
that it?
I think also one of the stories, I mean, he's also a big fan of storytelling, even though he tells the same stories. But one of the
Okay.
stories
Yeah.
he told me was
Yeah.
that I think he learned one of the languages he needed for a job. Like I told him, I remember he was also going through like a depressive time after his first startup failed. Like he built a relatively large, not his first, but I think one of the largest startups that he built,
Mm.
and it went poorly because of some business partners and stuff like that.
Mm.
A
Okay.
typical failure
Right.
story. But
Yep.
after that, he needed a job, also as a freelancer in a up and coming like fintech startup.
Mm.
And back then, he said he learned the language that he needed to, even though he didn't. He only got referred to in the job, but he learned the language he needed to in like one weekend. So he says like I think you can learn the language. Um,
Mm.
it's not a big deal to not know the language. I think generally engineering skills and like planning, design, like all these things are probably more important than the actual like understanding the language part. So
Yeah, I don't know whether you agree. I was given this advice when talking to software engineers, right? They were saying that you when you look at someone that is fairly experienced, you would trust that they were able to do their job because they are able to hold their job for a certain amount of time. But what you want to look out for is their ability to be able to communicate what they're doing to you, because by being able to communicate that well, their thought process well, it is an extension of their ability as a software engineer. So what do you think about it? Do you agree with that? And having worked with so many software engineers, yeah.
I definitely agree with that. I think one of the things uh, I also look out. I was like an engineering manager for about a year in my previous job,
Yeah.
and there I had the opportunity to coach junior and mid-level engineers who wanted to become senior engineers in terms of like what was important. And obviously, this is not just a career path. Like this was what was important for working with other people and working with also yourself in delivering stuff. I think communication is one of the most important aspects of a software engineer because you're not writing code for yourself. You're not designing solutions or exploring,
Mm.
these technical or product challenges by yourself, right? A
Yeah.
lot of times it involves your customers or even internal stakeholders, like
Yeah.
the customer-facing teams.
Mm.
And if you get it wrong, like your initial parts of the initial request wrong or parts of what is required or delivery requirements in terms of the technical requirements, usually it's not a problem in a sense of like this is wrong, you're a bad engineer, but then it just creates more overhead of like, okay, let's fix it again. There's a
Yeah.
lot of back and forth.
Mm.
At some later point in time, someone might read the code or read the documentation and like, I don't really understand why this is the case.
Mm.
And you have to spend a lot more time and effort trying to
Yeah.
rediscover everything again. So
Yeah. Yeah.
saving like someone who is very senior in my experience is someone who is able to do this kind of right in the first place.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
they're able to get to a level they are able to understand how other people also like theory of mind, I would say, like from someone else's perspective, how would they read
Yeah.
this document, how would they read this code and be able to
Mm.
understand what I'm trying to do here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, from what you're describing, I think what the person further said is that if this person is messy in their communication, then their code will be messy because they are not
Yeah.
able to structure it properly. So, I it's really good to hear that kind of perspective because I can't code, right, but even though I'm actually able to, I guess I'm somewhere in the middle to be able to kind of be that translate
Hmm.
layer, right. So when I was actually hiring engineers, I didn't quite know how to. I was worried about the technicalities because obviously I can't, determine whether they are actually able to code, right? But they are saying like, you know what, leave that to me. But you need to be able to assess their thought process. Are you able to kind of work with them well? Because if they're not able to kind of communicate that thought process well enough to you, then it doesn't matter how technical they are. Because
Yeah.
the kind of stereotype is really that they are always gonna be kind of like if you talk about the scale, right, on a continuum, the communication is something that you deprioritize when it comes to software engineer, right? But it doesn't seem like that's the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's kind of like your first job being on the part time, and I realized that after that you went on to um, um, other roles, like for example, I think you went to, was it uni for industry, and then also with
Hmm.
parcel lab, right? Um,
Yep.
how were those for you? Like, how did you kind of like
Hmm.
make the jump over there?
Hmm.
What's that transition like for you? What's that journey like for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for me, the end of my first job ended out in me burning out. So
Oh
that was very
dear, was it
interesting.
was it a lot of
Uh,
crunch? Tell us a little bit more about that.
yeah, so I mean, that was also a very interesting experience
Yeah.
because I think it was my first kind of, I would say, experiencing some sort of not my first experience, but one of the more recent ones, experiencing some kind of like mental breakdown. Like
Mm.
at the end of my first job, we were not in a good financial position. It was also obvious because of a very small company. It was like less than 10 people. It
Right.
was obvious things were not going super well for the business plan that we had of like, splitting up one part e-commerce platform, one part kind of an agency.
Mm.
Um, and I think I was very invested in it because it was such a small company. I also liked the
Yeah.
job. I liked the people there, the
Yep.
organization. It was definitely more
Yep.
like working with people you liked a lot.
Right.
And I think one of the projects that we were doing at the end to, get some significant amount of money to kind of kickstart the SaaS part of the business was very challenging. Like we only had two to three developers trying to migrate two existing old e-commerce systems that were not maintained into a very new one that was not even stable, but like they wanted to migrate to an alpha beta version of it. So like you can see already the
Mm.
like each dealing with each individual part was already a challenge, and having to deal with three different ones, different systems, you had to relearn everything.
Right.
So I spent a lot of time. Like I definitely overworked. I didn't
Right.
really know how to manage my
You were
own.
still part time at this point in time.
No. This by this
Okay.
time I was
Right.
already full time.
Full time. Okay.
So
Okay. Right.
yeah, it was. I think by the time I graduated, I decided to stick on in a full
Yeah.
time position,
Mm-hmm.
and then this was 2 years down the road. I think
Mm. Mm.
2018, 2019. Yep,
Right. Right.
end of 2019.
Yeah.
And it was here I didn't really manage my own mental health, mental well-being.
Yeah.
I worked like 60-hour weeks. Was definitely
Mm.
very stressed out, but also I think this was a part, kind of a bias in my part, cognitive bias, that I didn't see it. Like I thought, I studied psychology. I would recognize the symptoms when I would be, burning out.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
did not. Like I think it got to a point. Like my girlfriend who lived with me, she definitely recognized it earlier than I did
Yeah.
because it's easier for them to see. And
Yeah.
she was telling me you probably should see someone, or like there is something not going right.
Mm. Mm.
But then I think only like 3 months to 6 months down the road, that's when I think towards the end of the year, I recall end of 2019 was
Mm.
when I really experienced burnout, where like I suddenly in the middle of the day really decided I could not work anymore. I broke down in tears. I was like, wow, this is intense. I couldn't deal with this. I called my boss, and then told him I can't do this anymore. And it was very surprising to me as well because there is kind of gradual process downwards, and then suddenly you hit the cliff, and then it just like drops down, and then you just feel like you can't do anything
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
a few weeks, kind of.
Yeah.
I took a break, and then I decided I don't know, I had very strong feelings about going back to the same place.
Mm-hmm.
It was not out of like, I disliked anyone there or anything like that. It was just, I think the experience was relatively traumatic for some reason. And
Mm.
so
Mm-hmm.
there's some kind of emotional parts that are attached to this place. Yeah.
Understand. Right.
So,
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I've experienced my own burnout during the consulting times, and of course, during the 3 years of building a startup in a young and small team, I can relate to you in terms of that bond and the emotional attachment and things like that are definitely much stronger. And that cliff that you mentioned about, I actually there was a moment in time, I think several years ago. I There was a split second, right? I just thought like, what if everything just ends here? And I was like, I caught myself. I'm like, no, this cannot, right? I immediately went and seek help, and that's kind of the kind of like the turning point for me. And I think to your point around like you thought you would recognize the signs yourself, and everything was okay, and I kind of see it as a sense that your mind seems to be still okay. That's why you feel like you can continue, but your body is trying to tell you it's shutting down, right? That's kind of how it happened for me at the very least, right? When it stops functioning, I started having like what I then later found out was tension headache every single time there's a trigger. The tension headache will just come around like the forehead area, to the side of to the side of your head, right?
mhm.
And then I would get like gastric symptoms and things like that. These are all like what we know in psychology as psychosomatic
Yeah.
symptoms, right? It had to take that for me to recognize that it was bad. And I think similarly further down the road, and I thought that I was pacing myself. But then I developed psychosomatic symptoms as well. So I thought like, you know what, it's time to kind of rethink how I manage the mental health aspects of really just making sure that I can strike that balance and creating some habits as well.
Mhm.
I In terms of it being traumatic for some reason, I think I can relate to that. Even though like you don't necessarily think that there's any ill feelings or whatever it is. Uh, I then also realized later on that trauma at the workplace is something really real, even though um, a lot of us may not use that word, and if you felt like it's a very strong word, but the fact that you are not able to continue your daily activity and you are so emotionally affected, that basically meant that I went through trauma, and I need to be able to kind of recognize that. And thank you so much
Yeah.
for sharing your story. Was that kind of like your foundation of being able to sustain your career for in the tech space for another couple of more years after that?
Yeah, I think so. Like, definitely after that experience, after going through therapy and some coaching, it was definitely more understanding, okay, I need to pace myself for sustainable work. I think I also see that a lot in others in this space of, startups to scale ups, people who are very invested in the growth, the development of the company, the vision, people around you. There is much more risk of overworking and putting too much of yourself into it than the other way of like, being too lazy or not motivated. That tends not to be the case. I think
Yeah, for sure. I
I
think
realize,
go ahead,
yeah,
go ahead.
for myself and also for like when you work in a team that you have to recognize these. And this definitely helped me in the later few jobs that I had. Yeah.
Right, right. And like, how much do you think it's organization? I mean, that we always talk about this, right? How much of it is organization? How much of it is yourself, right? Because being in a startup, everything is messy. Everything is unstructured. There is gonna be scope creep every day. It's almost like it's a default that scope creep is gonna happen, right?
Hmm.
So how much of it is actually the organization, and how much of it is actually yourself, right?
Interestingly, this was a question I asked myself when I left Parcel Lab. So that was the previous company
Yeah.
I was in, and then now going to Leapsome.
Mm.
So Parcel Lab was also an e-commerce based company.
Yeah.
They sent out emails for almost a lot of the online retailers that you know.
Mm.
So an example would be IKEA or H&M. When you buy something and they send you an email after saying like, okay, this will be delivered when and when, this is all sent through Parcel App. So they're kind of an
Yeah.
invisible company doing all these
Mm.
technical stuff. It was very stressful, and what was my initial point?
The organization versus
Yeah, the organization,
yeah.
exactly. So I initially thought, okay, going through a scale up where we were changing the processes every 2 to 3 months, we were changing what we wanted to do every 3 months. It was not easy to deal with. I was already leading a team back then, and I felt a lot of pressure to both help my team and also shield my team from the chaos that's happening naturally on the business side of like discovering what we want to do, and also to help them like deliver what they needed to do, right? Like it's always this in between.
Yeah.
If you're someone in between.
Yeah.
And initially I feel like one of the reasons was like one of the reasons I left was like, okay, this cannot be it cannot be so chaotic, and is it true that we always have to go through these challenges? And I heard that there was a much more deliberate approach to scaling up and to organization building at Leapsome, because they are also focused in the HR space of like people enablement. And so I applied there. It was kind of the sole application I had. I wasn't really looking to for something, but it was definitely much more a pull factor of like, oh, this is very interesting. It's also in the area of organizational psychology. One shot, I just got to do it. I went there and I now discovered like, oh, they're also scaling up, and there are also these very similar challenges they're facing. So I imagine that's like, it is true for almost our organizations. Like,
Right.
we were also discussing this with my current engineering manager and a couple of other people, because
Yeah.
I feel like when you grow in terms of any organization, like even if you imagine a community of people online or even in real life, when you grow very quickly with very new, strange faces, when your average interaction, this was a theory I had and also read, when your average interaction is with someone new and not with someone existing, then you don't have you don't have many shared things. Like you don't have a shared value, you don't have shared ways of communicating or of interest and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's always like, I don't feel very connected to these people. And naturally, that creates some friction when you even talk about work, even though these are kind of seen as two separate things, right? Like typically you think of the organizational social part, like, oh, okay, it's cool if your colleagues are interested in the same things as you, but that's not particularly important. But here I feel like because you're building a company and rely on many of these personal interactions to kind of make things work in such a chaotic environment. If your average interaction is with someone you don't know, then you don't know how to communicate or how to deal with them, even though your job requires it. And in a very fast scaling startup, I think both these companies grew from about 50 people to 200 people in 2 years. So there is no way your average interaction would be with someone existing. Everyone you meet, 60, 70% of the time would be someone less than 6 months in a company.
Yeah. And do you think there's a way to kind of like combat this, right? Because at the end of the day, I read somewhere where we tend to think that we are thinking beings, like being humans, right? We are thinking beings that sometimes feels, but it's actually we are feeling beings that sometimes thinks logically. And I tend to think that is very, very true, right? Because the few books that I've been kind of like dabbling into around, like we are actually quite illogical a lot of the times, and we have these patterns, right? We are actually very feeling based, which is why I think I'm very fascinated in psychology in the very first place. And I think my approach in I guess leading teams, right? I tend to put a lot of emphasis around like being able to kind of be the servant leadership as much as I can, because I understand that work is already very challenging. It's going to be very chaotic out there. Similar to your approach around how like you would tend to want to be able to help your team to be able to deliver, but but you understand that in order for them to be able to deliver, you need to control the level of chaos, right? But but that's tiring in itself. It is a emotional burden on you, right? So do you think there's a
Yes.
way to kind of like manage all these things? Because at the end of the day, if you want to work in this space, are you saying that, we gotta embrace for the chaos and, be able to really just shut down and rest from time to time? Otherwise, this is gonna be the case, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a mix of these things. Very interesting that you said you also recognize like we're feeling based beings. I actually was not just a side note. Like I always thought that my approach to psychology was very cognitive based, and only in recent years after dealing with people so much that I realized, oh, okay, that's actually not the right approach. Like people don't think this way or process things this way. So it's very interesting to learn over the years too.
Yeah.
I think to be able to work in this space sustainably, I think taking a break and realizing that you don't have to deal with all the chaos all the time is probably the most important learning I had. Because initially I thought, okay, if you don't deal with it, things will go wrong. It's
Yeah.
not correct to have to have everything so chaotic, but now I'm slowly realizing that maybe it's not so bad. You should have, because ultimately it's a system. It's not individuals and it's not like a one-way feedback. Like having some of these bits of, I don't know, chaotic elements, not dealing with all of them kind of will organically transform some parts of the processes or organization.
Right.
And I
Kind
think
of like you
the,
have a hand in shaping
Mhm.
the system itself, right? But you need to recognize and accept the reality that it won't be there on day one, right? So you
Yes.
yeah, right. And what you said was very interesting is that it is actually a system, and system always needs to be upgraded and renewed, and you can inject new code. Sometimes there are bugs, right? Sometimes it doesn't work well as intended, and all that, right? But what I learned over the years, you have a longer tenure in startup than I did, but what I tend to realize and observe around is that there's something that's not quite healthy in the startup space, is really that um, especially when it comes to younger employees. I think
Mhm.
for people who are just starting out their career, for someone like us, like who has spent like a decade working, maybe we are able to kind of deal with it a little bit better. But for those people who have less than those amount of years of experience, they are looking for kind of like a path, right? They know that the startup scene
Mhm.
is exciting, the tech space is exciting, but they kind of want a little bit of a guidance in terms of where the hell am I gonna go, right?
Mhm.
But startups, at least for those that I've been observing, right, the bunch I've been observing has been saying that you got to chart your own career. In consulting, it was the same as well. But the difference between in consulting is that they have a system, right?
Mhm.
You play within the system. Whereas in startups, like they say there's going to be chaotic, there's no career path. And they really meant it because it's like loose. Everything is loose, right? How much
Yep.
of it, right, is that we're hiding behind that, we're just focusing on the goal, and this becomes secondary goals that we have in terms of like developing talent, right? And how much of
Mhm.
it is really that that's just the reality. There's no point about it. Have you seen some, really interesting career path direction kind of thing that allows less chaos to happen, right?
Mhm. I think there are multiple stages also of a startup,
Yeah.
and naturally there are kind of different modes of work. I would say pre-product market fit, where you don't have like a big bunch of customers that are your advocates. Naturally, it is going to be chaotic and going to be very flexible, but also the size of the company typically allows more for it. I think most of the startups that are less than 30 people, you could change your direction relatively easily because you could see everyone eye to eye kind of in a room and make that decision.
Mm.
Past that stage, once you are scaling up, you will realize at the end of your kind of hyper growth stage where you grew from 50 to 200 people that you realize now, oh shit, you can't do that anymore. You can't decide from one day to the next, like, oh, okay, let's not going to address, this whole product segment. We're just going to
Yeah.
switch, and you realize that no, it's not going to happen tomorrow or even the next month. Like
Mm.
from a founder's or like the leader's perspective, it does not naturally happen anymore. And
Mm.
that's where I think, from their perspective, okay, this needs to change. From the perspective, I think you're asking of like an individual working in these environments, right? I think at an early stage startup, it is easier naturally for someone to just go along with the ride. And I think for younger people, unfortunately, that means also a bit more um, flexible or dynamic working hours. There are probably days where there are issues that you have to fix for your early customers that you don't want to lose. And unfortunately, you have to do a 10, 12-hour day because you have to fix those before you go to bed, right?
Yeah.
And there are days probably where you have really nothing much and you can explore some things. And so that definitely trends towards that kind of a lot of peaks and troughs, you know.
Yeah.
And then when it's scaling up, the amount of work that you have in terms of both the technical work and also the organizational work will already be more than the capacity you have. That's, I think, in both the most recent roles I had, that was definitely the case, where the amount of things you want to achieve is definitely, you spend 60 to 80 hours a week, you will still not do it. And this is where kind of prioritizing and setting boundaries come in. Alongside, you know, in parallel, the organization is also trying to do that. So naturally, I think it comes at a very, you know, good time. So understanding how you can contribute to the organization. Typically, this is also when I think joining at a later stage of your career makes a bit more sense, because now you understand, okay, this is my value. You know, it's not necessarily I'm the fastest coder or the most expert coder. Maybe I can communicate really well. I can organize things really well. And this is, you know, what I can do best. And I know. So like I think one of the other things is like not looking at it at a very short timeline. It's not like, okay, you know, I was slow this cycle, this sprint, and this is going to be bad. But more like over a longer period of time, you know, was I able to deliver most of the things I did? And this is generally a better overview. And I think this kind of short-term outlook is better at at an earlier stage startup and earlier in your career. But I think as you progress along your career, then you know you have to look at, okay, what can I do in the next month, in the previous month, or even this quarter? Yeah,
Right.
I think that naturally changes. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you talk about like during the earlier stage, you just really just got to do whatever it takes, right, to be able to, I guess, find a footing. Otherwise, you know, the company wouldn't even exist probably.
Yeah.
If you don't find a footing, right? So you know, it's really exciting. I think the first few years, especially the first year, it's especially exciting because you know, I came in not knowing a lot of the different aspects, right? Because I come from a more like a larger organization. I ended up needing to do like figuring out payroll, you know, figuring out you know, websites, you know, mobile websites and stuff like that. I've never done you know, got my hands dirty in that, marketing, everything, right? Reading contracts, lengthy contracts and stuff like that, right? So definitely kind of learned a lot from that, and having that, you know, longer term perspective, I think, you know, how it actually adds up to your overall career journey. I think to maintain that perspective, I think it's definitely something that I think will be very helpful, right? So speaking about all this like seemingly advices to people that, you know, are probably younger, you know, what are some of the, I guess, you know, the advice that you have, or maybe the lessons that you have learned over the years, you know, being in the, you know, your pivot into your software engineering and, you know, in the tech space, right? What are some of the, I guess, biggest lessons that you wish you have learned earlier, right? That you could share with someone that perhaps want to come into this space, or, you know, do a career pivot, for example.
I think some of the most valuable lessons I have. I think the first one was that it's, especially in software, it's possible, and also I guess to an extent startups and tech startups, it's possible to learn a lot of these things without going through formal education. And there are a ton of resources out there that you can pick up, learn along the way. I think the internet obviously is a very good resource. For people who are starting out in tech, I found that online courses were very kind of high value in terms of how much you pay and how much time you invested in learning particular skills. And typically, if you're interested in kind of the startup and tech space, you typically need very specific skills at the very start. It's rare that you need, like, you know, a wide variety of skills. Typically, you are looking to solve very specific problems. And investing a bit in yourself and learning all these things on your own goes a very long way. It's definitely one of the most valuable lessons. A lot of the programming stuff, tech stuff, also the communication stuff is all.
Right.
I think I all did it through like Udemy or various online
Right.
courses.
Yeah. And I want to
Um,
kind of dig a little bit deeper into that, right? Because you mentioned something really interesting around like typically at the start, if you're trying to kind of do this kind of role, it's very rare that you need a variety of skills. So especially in software engineering, you kind of need to pick your language, right? So there's so many
yeah.
yeah, ranging from Python to all the Ruby on Rails, JavaScript, you name it, right? So is it
Yeah.
really like pick your poison? Is it JavaScript? If it's JavaScript, if it's Ruby on Rails, if it's mobile and mobile programming like your iOS or your Android, just pick one,
Mhm.
learn that, find a way in really applying that people that need that, right? And start from there. Is
Yeah.
that what it is, right?
I think so. I think your advice definitely rings true because you're typically looking, especially if you did not have, you didn't hold a previous role in tech,
Mm.
and now you're looking to go into it. I think the best is to target a specific, relatively popular. I would say, obviously, it doesn't work if you're picking something very unpopular and you have to look and go
What's
through like a hunt.
wanted to kind of get your get your view on this. What's popular nowadays, right?
I think what you said, like most of the stuff you said, is pretty popular. So like, I think Python, JavaScript, Ruby, I think have its popularity now. It's all right. Um, Mobile development will always be there because
Yeah.
of how pervasive it is. And yeah, these are kind of the easy ways to start. They're
Mm.
also relatively, I think popularity is not so much also on the job application, but finding resources, right? There's so
Mm.
many also free resources, and it's easy to find for popular languages. Yeah.
Right. And which I guess let's say if I want to learn mobile programming, for example, where would you recommend me to kind of pick up some of these free courses, right?
I would say like Apple, if you're interested in like the Apple ecosystem, they do already have a ton on their own kind of developer websites. Otherwise, I personally like Udemy a lot because
Mm.
you can get at their sales for like 12 USD, a pretty comprehensive course in building like 10 applications in mobile or 10 applications in on a web framework. And I think that's the most important bit if you're going into
Mm.
the space as like a junior. Yeah,
Right.
because typically someone wants to see like, oh, you have interest in learning and you can already contribute. Obviously, expectation as a junior is not you're super productive in day one, but
Right.
eventually with a bit of coaching, with like 3 months, 6 months, you can get
Right.
there.
How important is as you're starting up, like for you, for example, you started freelancing and stuff like that, right? But I would imagine for you to kind of land your first client, for example, you got to show them what you can do. So how
Hmm.
important is really having some contribution on sites like GitHub, for example?
Hmm.
What's the other one? Stack Overflow, for example.
Hmm.
How important are those things, to be able to kind of showcase? It's kind of like marketing, right? Because marketing, you need to have a portfolio to be able to show people your design, your writing, or
Yeah.
whatsoever. So similarly to programming, how important are those as well?
I think those are definitely more important for mid-career engineers, or if you're looking to go into it, not as like a super junior. As a junior, I think it helps, especially showcasing others. Like you're interested in the area of tech, even outside of work. I would say this is kind of the special area that's different in tech roles than other roles because typically you don't need, for example, if you're doing, let's say, finance, controlling, accounting, like people don't expect to see a portfolio of what you did if you're going into it as a junior. Like they expect you already have the skills and you can contribute in a relatively fixed way. But the general impression, fortunately or unfortunately, in the tech space is that if you have this, it definitely kind of sets you apart from all the other candidates. Um, Typically, it's very hard to tell the value of a candidate when you look at their CV, right? Like they can say,
Mm,
okay, I
yeah.
know JavaScript, Python, blah, blah, blah. You can list all the right things there. And then the interview process also sometimes it's very hard to, from 2 hours or from a coding exercise, be able to tell, can this person do it beyond, the surface level. And having a portfolio shows one interest, and two, also if you have, highlight contributions that you did for kind of, it doesn't even need to be an open source community, but for even personal projects.
Right.
It is a kind of an area where you can showcase your skills.
Right. So kind of like, if let's say like I wanted to kind of get like a iOS gig, for example, I'll show that, hey, this is a prototype that I was working on, right? And you just show it
Yep.
on your personal space. It doesn't have to be something that you've already published or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because there's a limit of how much information you can give through the interview process, right?
True.
Like
Yeah.
you have a
For
limited
sure.
time.
Yeah. They say
And
the
this
real
is
interview
yeah.
happens when you're on the job, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Right. And let's talk a little bit about the country, right? How you've lived there for so many years now. How's it like over there? What's work-life balance over there? Malaysia, I guess in Asia in general, we're still ranked as one of the overworked cities, right? So how's life over in Germany, in Munich, for example, right?
I would say work-life balance is generally socially much more enforced here. Especially if you don't work in a startup and you work in a small medium enterprise and also a corporation, there are a lot of existing kind of employee protection rules that make sure like you don't overwork. Even if you have burnout, for example, there are mechanisms to protect you and provide like mental health care for you. And if you want to go back into work, they also have mechanisms to say like you don't start out at 40 hours a week, but you start out at like 8 hours a week and 16 hours, and then slowly, gradually. So there is a lot of, and it's also very socially acceptable generally. Like taking time off, for example, is very respected here. I think I have the same experience working back home, both Malaysia and Singapore, where even on your off days, people tend to message you like, hey, I just need a quick question, please answer this. Here it's very, I think in some companies even forbidden by law, especially if you have like a union. And even socially, like it's entirely fine. Like your time off as your time off, like you're not expected to answer anything. And people see it as very strange if you're all the time back at work, even if you're taking time off. Yeah. So it's both a social and also like legal framework for this.
Right. Something you mentioned was quite interesting around like helping you to transition back once you like let's say you went through a burnout, for example, helping you to kind of transition back. Is that like the healthcare institutions or the mental health care institutions that are saying that hey, advising your employer, for example, that this person just recovered, please don't start this person off at 60 hours, please start at 40 or 30. Is that an advice coming from a kind of like a care provider organization, or is that just something that is prescribed to you, like, hey, you got to take care, right? So you got to deal with your employer on your own. You get what I mean?
I actually don't know the details, but from my conversations with some other friends who went through this process, I think they do get like a doctor's note. So it is kind of from the provider.
Coming from a professional going to the organization. Oh, wow, okay. Yeah, I mean, like, over here you can imagine, right? It's like, okay, my doctor said that I got to start take it easy. Nobody's going to take you seriously. So it definitely helps if there's a doctor's letter or doctor's note, definitely, right?
Yes.
And you mentioned that if you work, I took note of the distinction you made, right? If you work in organizations and SMEs, then that's fine. But does it not apply for startups in general in Germany as well?
Like the same laws and social frameworks apply, but it just tends to be a little less strict when it comes and enforced when it comes to startups.
I see.
Because of the nature of like dealing with very dynamic stuff. But obviously, being in this ecosystem also means that your customers work differently. I think this is where the whole ecosystem doesn't apply the same kind of pressure to each other, like,
Mm,
companies' expectations of each other.
right,
Of course, it is generally still higher, like, because you're buying a service or a product from someone else, you have expectations,
right.
but it tends to be less bad. Like, people don't expect you to answer your request at, 12 a.m. and
Mm,
midnight.
got it.
It's more like if you're working with people internationally and from different time zones, that's where these other pressures come in. But I think locally in Europe, it tends to be relatively speaking, relaxed compared to Asia,
Right.
definitely.
Yeah. And the uh so for Lipsum, do they work internationally as well? Is there like like higher expectations when it comes to delivery and service excellence?
hmm I think yes. Part of it is that they're expanding to the U.S. market, and
Mm.
people in the U.S. market. I think if you're trying to compete in the tech space, definitely they
Yeah.
are kind of the benchmark to beat, right?
Yeah, they're working
In
around the
terms of
clock. They're working
yes,
around the clock. Yeah.
in terms of like fixing bugs or even service availability, reliable or like even availability of
Right.
people to do support or customer service, like they are definitely the benchmark in terms of all these things. And if you're expanding there, then you got to slowly adopt uh, that kind of expectation. I think it slowly trickles down, but generally, because you're still working here and most of your
Mm.
colleagues are in Germany, it still doesn't feel, I'm only guessing because I've also never worked in the US. I'm only
Yep.
guessing it's not the same as working there. You still get the same benefits of like, 20 to 30 days vacation a year.
Mm.
Um, you still have your medical insurance. You don't have to worry about a lot of these things. Um,
Yeah,
so
for sure. Right. Yeah, so we're up to the hour almost, and
okay, cool.
this has been really fun. I think yeah, the funny thing is the funny how life works is that it took us more than 10 years to get to this point to really get to know even your earlier stories, right? In terms of like how your parents are in more the technical fields and how you got into all this technical
Yeah.
aspects. The impression I had so many years back was really that Chao is someone that has a lot of skills, photography. He dabbled in music and stuff like that. So it's really interesting to be able to kind of really reconnect today to kind of know your story. But before we go, I was wondering if there's anything that you like to kind of I guess end on in terms of like maybe an advice for someone that is perhaps one of three things, right? One, maybe considering a career switch into a startup, for example, because I find
Mhm.
myself when I came from an organization that are larger into a startup, it's a totally different thing altogether. The considerations are so different, and I
Mhm.
wish I would have somebody to advise me back then, right? So either you're thinking about a career into a startup, or you're thinking about coming into tech, software engineering, for example, or the last thing is maybe thinking about switching countries, right?
Mhm.
One of three things, right? What are some of the, I guess, the first thing that came to mind as a final piece of advice for those who are listening?
I would say maybe for those who are thinking of switching into tech, I'm definitely an advocate for people to learn at least some programming skills or some of these skills. And if you're thinking of moving into tech, I think a few very quick pieces of advice. I think one is start really small. I think one of the things is being very ambitious and learning a lot of stuff at the start and not knowing how to apply it. I think start small, like even Excel, Scratch, these small little playgrounds that allow you to experiment and get feedback very quickly. And also then, progress to somewhat easier frameworks like Python or JavaScript because it's much easier to get support and feedback for that. The second piece of advice is like ask for help. I think you don't know what you don't know, and sometimes it is very easy to fool yourself into thinking, okay, I already know, most of these things,
Yeah.
but it's at that point where you probably should be asking yourself, what are the things I'm not seeing? And obviously also learn how to ask for help. Unfortunately, this is definitely a more people-oriented skill and not so much a technical skill.
Mm.
I think it's really interesting to know how to nudge people to respond to you, providing context, providing background information, and being polite when you're asking stuff, not feeling you're entitled to an answer. Um,
Yeah.
and the cool thing nowadays is like look for online communities.
Mm.
GitHub is a good place to look for places to contribute and showcase, of course, the same thing we talked about to showcase your work. And not only in terms of technical work, but also how you communicate, how you triage, problems. It's
Yeah.
exactly the same kind of environment as a workplace, I would say. And this is a great place to showcase all of your skills and not only technical skills. Yeah.
Nice. Wei, thank you so much for spending your Saturday with me. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to be able to kind of, perhaps even meet you in Germany as well. The
Oh,
last time
yes.
I've been back to Germany was so many years ago. I think, more than probably like 9 years ago. I think
Oh, wow.
I went to the Bavaria region as well. I was
Hmm.
actually in a very small town. I think I visited Nuremberg at one
Hmm.
point, but really, the one thing that surprised me the most about Germany was because I never been to Europe before that at that point of time.
Hmm.
I was really surprised at the amount of bread that they eat.
Oh, yeah.
That
Yes.
was one thing that was super surprising to me. But really really enjoyed my time. So thank you so much, and I'll catch up with you soon. Thanks, Charlie. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for also asking. Glad to have this conversation. It was very interesting, definitely.